Dave Anderson,
Yes,
you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you.
I'm trying to get my volume up here so I can hear you.
Caught everybody not talking, so I hopefully you can hear. Good.
Okay.
We're expecting everyone, Dave.
Yeah, I see John Matthew is come on as an attendee, so I'm going to move him over to a panelist.
Okay. And then we're not sure about Bob.
Yeah, we're not sure. So he's going to try to
Okay.
make it, but he wasn't sure about the tax situation.
Okay. Well, I have it at 7 o'clock.
Hmm.
So I think maybe we can get started.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so we will start our special meeting of May 17th, 2021. We are continuing our public hearing for application 21-03. My understanding is hopefully everyone on the agency has reviewed the updated materials. I'm sure there's still a lot of comment and interest, but if the applicant could maybe just update us, and Dave, you can step in here, but I don't think we need to go through everything again. We've done a lot of this, so maybe just touch on the points that were, I know there were some that were brought up specifically, and maybe a brief synopsis, but we'll try not to redo the meeting again if we can help that. But Dave, did you have any other?
No, I agree with that, and I think Attorney McKeon is prepared to go in that direction. So,
Okay, so start with the applicant and their kind of update.
Okay, good evening, everyone. For the record, my name is Chris McKeon. I represent the applicant. With me tonight is our team of professionals, Mike Ott, who is our site engineer, David Lord, who is our soil scientist, Rick Hosley, who is our geologist and blasting consultant, John Cunningham, who is our landscape designer, and Greg Nucci, who is the project architect. 2 weeks ago, we heard from the public and the interveners, as well as Mr. Logan and Mr. Trinkus on their behalf. Certain points, questions were raised, and since that time, we have filed additional reports. Mr. Ott has filed additional plans and responses to some of the points raised by the interveners and their experts. David Lord has submitted additional written materials in response to some of these particular issues that came up at the last meeting. Rick Hosley, as you will recall, at the last meeting had an internet glitch and was interrupted. But he has submitted additional written materials that have addressed certain issues and questions that arose. And lastly, John Cunningham, the landscape architect, if you recall, questions arose about garden area proposed for the site and the protocol for fertilizer and pesticide control over those sites. Cunningham submitted a letter to that effect. But what I would like to do tonight is to have Mr. Hosley present the brief information he was prohibited from presenting last time. And we'll begin with him, and then John Cunningham will be very brief about the protocol for pesticides, fertilizers relating to the garden, and how we can make sure that stays in effect as the project is built. Mike Ott will then briefly describe the changes to, or responses more aptly, to the plans he submitted, and responding to certain questions from both agency members and the interveners and the public. And then we'll wrap up with the brief presentation from David. And then I'd like to allow the interveners and those opposing the application to speak. And if I may, I'd like to conclude my remarks after that occurs, and hopefully close the public hearing. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Rick Hosley.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, commissioners, chairperson, and respectful listeners. I really appreciate this opportunity. Moving forward, I'd like to share my screen, if I may. I don't know if I need permission for that or not.
Go ahead, Rick. You can do that.
Thank you very much. Let's see what we have here. Bear with me a minute. Okay. Well, I can't seem to share the screen and see you folks at the same time. Can everyone see my screen?
No.
No.
Okay. Looks like we got a little technical difficulty. I see. I see your screen.
Mike, do you have the ability to pull up Rick's plan at all? Do you guys have it?
I don't, Dave. No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Rick, if it's something you can email to me, I'd be glad to try to share it.
Huh. All right. Let's try this. Uh-oh.
I have it up on my screen. If you're looking for the map showing the areas of the site, Rick, is that what you're looking for?
I'm looking for some photographs that I'd like to share with you. Okay, so I can see you, Chris, but I can't see the rest of the video for some reason. How about if, escape. Okay, let's start this again. Share screen. Huh. Well, let me do it.
So maybe if the photos can be emailed and we could hear from Mr. Cunningham while we sort this out?
Either that or maybe we should go to the,
I think going to Mr. Cunningham's a good idea. I've been in the office since 5 a.m.
Thanks, Joe.
Good evening, board, commission members, the people that are in attendance. My name is John Cunningham. I'm the owner of TEC Landscape Design Incorporated, member of the American Society of Landscape Architects for the last 30 years. I'm not a wetland specialist by any means, okay? And I have been involved in projects before when the boards would want to guarantee that anything used on either garden or lawn areas would be stipulated as being all organic, which I've put a letter to the town of Madison. It would probably go into the Planning and Zoning Commission and then be written into the bylaws once the application was approved. And we've said that we would use all organics. I'm hoping that the rest of the people that are surrounding this application might follow our same direction. The use of organics would be a much better solution than trying to put chemicals on any of these lawn areas or garden areas in that area. The one thing I will say is that I've been presenting to the Madison Wetland Board for probably 30 years. The wetland that's in question on the south is approximately 60 feet from our property line. From our property line, it's probably 80 to 90 feet to our first area of impervious construction. So we have a large green buffer on our own property, and then you have 50 to 60 feet of a natural vegetated area that is not on our property, but is not hopefully changing and probably not changing because it's getting closer to the wetlands. So with that dimension, I really don't believe that any water from our project would have any impact whatsoever on the wetland area that's in question. Thank you.
Okay, well, do any of the agency members have questions for Mr. Cunningham?
Nope.
Well, I don't know whether this is a question for Mr. Cunningham or Mr. Ott, but is my memory incorrect? I thought there's going to be more detail from a landscape architect perspective on that garden in the southeast corner of the property. Has that been done, or is Mr. Cunningham the right guy to ask about that?
Yeah, no, Mr. Cunningham is the right guy to ask. The garden in the right-hand corner, I'm looking at the plan in my office. It's really in the, let's see, northeast corner is, well, it's all pervious, meaning it's a wash stone base of 3 raised garden elements with an area, a green area that is around it. I've suggested lawn, so the entire area is permeable. There, in my professional opinion, there's no need to add any additional planting or any kind of filtration system from an area that's all permeable. The reason I mentioned the dimension, the 50 feet plus from the garden area is also permeable or acts as a filtration system. So we have probably 80 to 90 feet of a filtration system on our own land, and then an additional 50, 60 feet that is not on our property before we get to the wetlands.
I think, and Lee can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was also just question of what exactly that, it sounds like that garden is kind of an open space or a hanging out space. Is this going to be a vegetable garden? Is this, you know, are the people in these different units going to have their own plots? It's just, I think that was also part of the question of what exactly the purpose is and what kind of plantings will be there.
I think that's a good question. Usually those things, Kaloa, are decided upon after the HOA or whatever, however they want to set up the board for the community. Mr. Nucci and myself did a large presentation for a project in Old Saybrook. We did the same kind of community gardening out there. I guess people asked if they could add vegetables or herbs. So it's going to be a kind of a community garden thing. There might be one person in this development that really loves gardening. There might be 3 or 4 people that don't want to do anything with the gardening. So I think those decisions are probably based later on. I think the thing for the wetland board is to know that it's going to be an all organic garden. It's all on a permeable area. It's raised, so there's no erosion or anything else. It's contained in a large Corten steel garden bed, sitting on a washed stone base.
Is that
What's going
detailed
to
on,
actually go into garden, I think, is later on down the road.
is that detailed on the plans? I kind of,
Yes, it is.
oh, I kind of looked through it this afternoon. I couldn't see it, but,
It says right on the landscape plan. If you go to the landscape plan, raised steel planters, 30 feet by 5 by 24 inches high.
okay.
And then you're suggesting lawn for the rest of it then, just some kind of
Well,
grass.
the planters sit, if you look at the landscape plan, on a washed stone base, so you can move around
Yeah.
the planters on a washed stone area. And then there's a 5 to 6 foot area of a green element. If the wetland board really wanted that to be, I'm just going to use an example, a fern or a growing broadleaf ground cover as opposed to lawn area, totally fine with us. But it's a green element. It's not any kind of paving or surface or anything. And there's probably going to be a fence around the whole thing also to keep animals, and, you know, if people are walking on there, then they're not walking past the property line onto someone else's property, which we know has been a problem in that area.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, any other landscape questions from Mr. Cunningham? Okay, it looks like Mr. Halsey has sorted out the screen sharing. So we could go back to him if he's ready.
Hi, folks. There's a pause of silence. Did I miss something?
You're up.
Yeah,
Oh, wonderful. Thank
I
you very
just-
much. I got a little support from my technician, so hopefully we can get this right. I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully you can see a little presentation.
Yep.
And can you see my screen?
No,
Still cannot see my screen. It says you are sharing.
I can see it.
Okay.
I see it.
also.
Excellent. How's that?
Good.
Good. Okay. Sorry, folks. Again, thanks so much. I apologize for the delay. Thank you for your patience. I wanted to ensure you that I had multiple submittals that Chris sent to the commissioners for me. One included my resume. A second included a focus on the execution and impact of blasting on wetlands and adjacent structures, which is a reference for pre-blast planning, blast design, blast review, and blast compliance. I also sent an executive summary of the geologic setting, the rock removal, and the rock locations. And I don't wish to belabor this, but just a quick review. The rock at the ledges of Madison is referred to as the Waterford Group. It's characterized by tight, closed geologic structure that is generally not readily permissible. This is really important because water will not migrate through this. This is an example of the geology that we have seen in a presentation that I've given earlier. Remember, we had discussed the topography in terms of anticlines and synclines, ridges that run through the property, the estate itself sitting on top of the ridge to the north, a syncline where there is overburden, and then another anticline or ridge line where as we travel south, we approach the designated wetlands. This is a photograph shown earlier of the downward slope facing east toward the tennis courts, which is hidden by the brambles. This is a photograph looking north at the anticline that climbs toward the Ledges Estate. The tennis court is to my right. What is important about what I'm trying to bring up today in this presentation is that the Waterford Group represents an aquiclude. It's an impermeable body of rock that acts as a barrier to the groundwater on this site. This image is a little misleading because if we remember, we're dealing with the anticlines and synclines and the sloping ground that we referred to earlier. But these confining beds or aquicludes help to contain the aquifer and the wetlands, which we see designated on site. The Waterford Group in this image is the green band that you see, and its topography confines that wetlands. Here's an aerial view, the same sort of image that represents the top of the slope, the down gradient toward the west side of the tennis court, and the tennis court itself. At the top of the slope, as you're well aware, the ground slopes toward the north and toward the south. Runoff from the proposed ledges project will shed north at the excavation location where the construction is to the backyard of the Ledges Estate. On the other side of the top of the slope, water will run off toward the designated wetlands, as it always has. This is an image of the map that Mike presented earlier, and it designates the 100-foot inland wetland upland review area. The proposed location of Carriage House number 2 and the rock excavation associated with it is outside this 100-foot inland wetland review area. What I've done is to designate in green in this location the area of rock that is to be removed in order to meet the topographic construction elevations of Carriage House number 2. I call this location rock area number 4. Essentially, there are 4 rock areas on this property. This is the closest to the designated wetlands. As you can see, the rock area is approximately 14 feet that runs north and south and 30 feet east to west. The cut here is approximately 5 feet. And I say approximately, I think it's less than that, but essentially it has to be below the frost line for the bottom of footings in order to not freeze. A foot below that would be crushed stone. That gives us our 5-foot cut. This area works out to be approximately 75 cubic yards of rock to be removed in this area. This is another field image of that exact location. We're standing in the syncline behind the Ledges Estate, and we're looking to the south to the top of that slope. The line represents the edge of the Carriage House number 2, and the rock face to the right remains untouched and unexcavated. Another image standing on the top of the slope. To your left of this image, the ground slopes off toward the Ledges Estate, and to the right, just about where those white pines are, the ground and rock slopes toward the south toward the wetlands. This location has very shallow overburden. It's very close to bedrock. If you can see the stake there, this is not the actual corner of the carriage house. This represents a point 4 feet outside the carriage house, which would give the carriage house excavation and rock removal enough room in order to have working room to install concrete forms for this rock excavation. A little more detail on this rock excavation, which is the closest to the designated wetlands. It is outside the 100-foot wetland, inland wetland upland review area. The area is 14 feet by 30 feet. I scrutinized this with creative detail, with exacting detail, I must add. There is a 4-foot cut outside the foundation, again, for the working room for the forms, 78 cubic yards. In analyzing this rock removal area, I estimated that it would take approximately 6 hours to drill and blast and remove this area. It is a relatively small area, and as we've discussed in the past, the rock and its cleavage and its lineation allows it to break very readily without breaking beyond its desired line of excavation. I also threw in and provided an alternative method for rock removal at the request of the applicant. The applicant has been very demanding in the details of this. An alternative method for rock removal would be drilling weakening holes on 1-foot centers, approximately 3 feet below grade. That would equate to about 8 feet, 5 and 3, 6 and 3. And after drilling these holes, similar to what you'd refer to as Swiss cheese in layman's terms, a 5,000 to 7,000 pound hydraulic hammer would be used to chip out or split the rock. I estimated the time for that between 20 and 25 hours. I expect that it could be closer to 20 hours if the drilling process and the hammering process worked in conjunction. Again, this is another example of that stepped topography of the exposed geology on the ledge's site. These free faces, or these points of relief, make the rock relatively easy to fragment and remove. The analogy that I could draw is like splitting firewood. Certain types of firewood doesn't split very easily, cordwood. Other types splits very well with the grain. This is an example of the grain which lends itself to these points of relief or free faces that limit the line of excavation to exactly where you want it. You remember my image lineating the downward dipping joints in the rock mass. These joints run east and west. To the left of the screen would be the wetlands, approximately 100 feet away. What's important about this lineation is as you remove the rock, it fragments or breaks on these lineations, and it limits that, again, beyond the excavation point. I wanted to make that clear because during the last presentation, it seemed that there was some confusion about this. Blasting and explosives energy will not migrate beyond the desired limits of rock excavation, the desired limits or design limits. Vibration will not cause cracks that would make this bedrock permeable. Water will not flow through this rock after we blast it. It will to the point of where we fragmented it to break it, but not beyond that. Post rock faces will remain impermeable. Groundwater will not migrate 100 feet into the wetlands. Here's another example of some fragmentation on site, similar to the area that we looked at before. You can see that there's an area that's been fragmented from frost and water action. But if you look to the left or the right, there are limits. Those are predictable limits outside where the frost action has taken place. Again, I think you've seen this photo before in a previous presentation. Evidence from the explosives energy from this blast did not migrate into the rock mass because it was designed not to. This is how geologists and explosives engineers create stable slopes and free faces. Another example of a project in Stony Creek. This is within inches of the property line and 15 feet off of an existing house. This was conducted by line drilling and blasting. Another example of line drilling and blasting. Relative to the 49 blasting permits issued in Connecticut since 2010, The Ledges project falls well below the average of past rock removal quantities per project for blasting permits issued. I've heard multiple I've heard multiple statements that this is a large blasting project. There's a phenomenal amount of rock. Ultimately, there is less than 400 yards of rock in the combined areas on this site. This route truly is a minor rock removal project. I just wanted to clarify that. Because it is a minor rock removal project, it does not mean it should not be well planned and executed, which is why I submitted the submittals I have, specifically to focus on the execution and impact of blasting relative to this site. The rock removal portion of this project is very dynamic, but it is not potentially dangerous to the wetlands. And there'll be no negative impacts on the wetlands or the wildlife if this is done properly by following pre-planning, compliance, concurrent review of the blast design, and utilizing vibration analysis and sound monitoring. All of this is essential and is in my submittal. In conclusion, before I answer any questions, based on my experience as a third generation explosives engineer, the Ledges of Madison can realistically be conducted without causing damage to adjacent properties or wetlands. I'm very comfortable in deriving this conclusion that blasting for the application as presented can be performed without compromising the structural or cosmetic integrity of the adjacent structures. I know this because we do this on a daily basis, and I have hundreds of recommendations and past experiences with this. Certainly, the degree of assurance of safety and success, as well as attaining the goals and requirements of this site, are directly proportional to the qualifications, insight, and involvement and application of the pre-blast plan, the blast design, review of the test blast during implementation. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a bit and ask if you have any questions.
I have a quick question. You say that relative to 49 blasting permits, this one, in your opinion, is a minor project. So did you I'm always interested in numbers. Did you have a range of what those numbers, where exactly in those 49 your project ends up?
I didn't think it was necessary to determine a range per se in terms of volume. What I looked at was what the average size was, and the average size is typically over 500 cubic yards.
Okay. So you don't have a sense of how many projects were over 500 and how many were under. Yours is at 407. I'm just curious. I mean, you gave those specific numbers, so just wondering, it would be interesting to see where you end up instead of just saying that it's minor compared to what. I mean, I didn't pull all the permits.
Sure. I did not pull all the permits, but I'm familiar with the locations. I'm certainly not familiar with the details, but I can say that 500 yards of rock blasted per permit is based on the explosives quantity attributed to the permits is much lower than average.
Okay. Are there other questions for Mr. Hawley?
Mr. Hadley, I got one, and that is, can you remind us what the details of the vibration analysis and the sound monitoring as part of the blasting execution, what exactly that means?
It means that during all blasting operations, there shall be seismographs set up to monitor ground motion and air overpressure. And seismographs should be located between the blast site and the nearest adjacent structure of concern. That structure of concern can be a well. It could be a home. It could be whatever is of importance. And multiple seismographs can be set up in arrays to determine and predict what ground vibration will be over distance. And in my submittal, I submitted a chart by the US Bureau of Mines, which provides a starting distance versus charge weight prediction of vibration before you have any details on site. And I'm advising the applicant, if they were to hire a blasting contractor and choose that method for rock removal, that they perform a test blast. And that is a very small blast that generates ground motion at various distances based upon this array, that so you can calculate what ground motion readings will be adjacent to structures when you blast closer to them. For example, I believe whether this project gets approved or not, at some point in the future, the water main that travels down the driveway of this residence will need to be renewed, refreshed, repaired. In doing so, I don't believe, and I have no proof to this, but I don't believe that that water main is down to grade. It may require blasting to lower that to grade in order to keep it from, in order to help maintain it into the future, keep it from freezing, that sort of thing, depending on its diameter and what it's constructed of.
So has that vibration analysis been designed? Is that part of the application then, I guess? I don't know
It
how that
is,
works.
and it is in the submittal on the focus. There is a
Okay.
guideline which gives you distances and charge weights that was produced by the Office of Surface Mines and the US Bureau of Mines. And then there's a recommendation to set up seismographs based on these distances and perform a test blast.
Okay. And the sound monitoring, how does that work?
That is in conjunction. Seismographs monitor both ground motion in 3 different dimensions as well as air overpressure.
Okay.
These units are calibrated the same way a speedometer in a state trooper's automobile would be calibrated. There's a calibration certificate that comes with that. Reports can be analyzed by seismograph manufacturers to see and understand frequencies and particle velocities.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
All right, thank you. So who is next? Is it Mike Ott? Yes.
I think so. Good evening. For the record, I'm Mike Ott. I'm a licensed professional engineer and land surveyor with Summerhill Civil Engineers on Wall Street in Madison. So I've been doing this for 33 years. I just did the math. And I have worked for 3 different professional engineering and land surveying firms. I have been a consulting town engineer for the town of Old Saybrook, and I was, as you know, the director of public works and town engineer for the town of Madison. I'll try to be as brief as I can. We submitted a response to Mr. Trinkus's second review letter that I hope you all have. I'm not going to go through that letter completely, nor will I go over the site again as requested. I'll try to keep this as short as I can. But there's a couple points I want to make in case I may have missed some things in my response to the review letter. So there's a few things that I think needs to get on the record, get into the record for the application, I should say. So on the south side of the Ledges Estate building, which I've, in my report, I've called the South Catchment Area. If you remember, the site is divided. It's pretty obvious. It's naturally divided into 2 different drainage or catchment areas. The north side closest to Birnbaum Lane, and the south side where the two wetlands are at the off-site at the southwest and southeast corners. So the first thing I'd like to address in that southern catchment area, we were unable to take measurements to locate the off-site inland wetland boundary to the southeast. As you know, the inland wetland boundary to the southwest was mapped by Richard Snarsky a number of years ago, and it's shown on maps that are filed in the town's land records, as well as on our documents that we've submitted. The wetland to the southeast, if I understand it correctly, we've requested permission to enter onto the property to take measurements so we could tell how far it is from the property boundary, but we didn't receive that permission. Our survey crew, our surveyors, our land surveyors have indicated to me, and this was my, I am also, I don't know if I think I mentioned, I am also a licensed land surveyor. It's been my experience too that the use of the reflectorless mode of measurement with a total station to locate wetland flags, there's no guarantee that we will get an answer that would make sense for a number of reasons, including there's no way to tell that laser, whether that laser pulse is actually hitting something behind the wetland flag. We use that methodology, very simple common practices to measure the height of a building for zoning compliance. We do that all the time. But the licensed land surveyors who did this survey do not feel comfortable. So I think I just have to say again for the record, I think you all saw the wetland boundary the day we did the site walk, and we actually were told that day that it had been delineated in the field, and I think we all at least walked over to the property boundary, and certainly some of us walked over to the actual wetland boundary. So we estimate that it's some 60 to 70 feet away from the property boundary. To be conservative, let's say it's 50 feet away from the property boundary. We know, and I'm saying all this for the record, we know that within the 100-foot upland review area, we are definitely removing the existing carriage house building, the garage and the apartment. We're constructing a garden area as Mr. Cunningham described, and we're removing the pavement that's in front of that building and turning it into a lawn area. There's no question that those activities would be within 100 feet of that off-site wetland. There is all in the included in the construction of the lawn area is some grading, of course, as shown on the plan. But it's pretty obvious if you study the plans and if you stand out there at the property boundary that those activities that I just described are the activities within that 100-foot upland review area from that off-site southeast wetland. The wetland to the southwest, as Rick Hosley just described, and you'll remember me saying this in the past in other meetings, I initially conservatively estimated the amount of disturbance on our parcel within the 100-foot upland review area. As you can tell from Mr. Hosley's presentation, we are not disturbing anywhere near what I conservatively estimated. I think you'll recall that I even said that at the site walk, that I had conservatively estimated the disturbance area on our parcel within the 100-foot upland review area of that southwest wetland. The next thing I'd like to just get into the record is the amount of existing impervious land cover or impervious surface in the southern catchment area versus the proposed area of impervious surface. So today, the impervious surfaces consist of pavement and building. And there is approximately today, and I'm rounding to the nearest 100 square feet or so here, there is approximately 7,400 square feet of impervious surface between the pavement and that carriage house building. And that carriage house building is as close as 4 feet from the property boundary that is closest to the wetland. So if we assume conservatively that the wetland is 50 feet away, the carriage house building is 54 feet away. If that makes sense to everybody. In front of that carriage house again is pavement. So today there's approximately 7,400 square feet of pavement, of impervious surface, pavement and building. And when if the proposal were to be constructed, there would be approximately 12,700 square feet of impervious surface. So that's a significant difference, greater than 4,000 additional impervious surface. However, if you remember, we're removing the carriage house building. That's about 1,725 square feet. And we're removing approximately 2,900 square feet of pavement. So the ultimate difference ends up being about 1,100 or 1,200 square feet of increase of impervious surface. I don't know how clear I just explained that, but I guess what I'm saying is between the removal of the carriage house building and the removal of the pavement and the new construction, we only have an increase in impervious surface of 1,100 or 1,200 square feet. More importantly than that, and please stop me if you have any questions. More important than that, I think, is the carriage house garage building, like I said, is as close as 4 feet to the closest property boundary to the offsite wetland. And right in front of it, if you remember, is pavement. I think the most important thing to understand here is we are removing that carriage house apartment building and removing all of the pavement in front of it, such that when the proposal, the closest impervious surface that drains to that wetland will be 110 feet from the property boundary closest to the wetland. So again, if we assume the wetland is 50 feet away, the closest impervious surface that will drain to that wetland would be 160 feet away. And that can easily be seen just by looking at the drawings. Does that make sense to everyone? Does anybody have any question about that? I guess I'll just say one more time, I think that's important. The fact that we're removing that building, removing that pavement, and replacing it with a community garden space and lawn. We're not changing any surface water drainage patterns, but we are changing the land surface cover within, using our assumed wetland distance, within 160 feet of that wetland when the project is built. Any questions so far? Okay. The stormwater management system, there's been a review comment, and it's a good comment, that we need to make sure that we capture the surface water runoff that we're saying we're collecting. And the engineer who's done the review has talked about curbing. We do not want to install curbing. This parking court is uncurbed, but if you were to study, and I said this in my letter, if you were to study the grading and all the spot elevations, we are attempting to create a pavement surface that drains around the outside of the parking court circle and then to the lowest part of the parking court and off the pavement over lawn into the inlet structure to the subsurface infiltration system. To ensure that that happens, we've changed the grading a bit on the downslope side of the inlet structure, raised it up a bit so that surface water runoff could not bypass the inlet structure and would have to enter the inlet structure. So that's how we've addressed that. Again, that's a good comment, and that's how we addressed it. Any questions on that? So the subsurface stormwater infiltration system, I think it's important to say again that it has been designed and sized to temporarily store and infiltrate the surface water runoff from certain rainfall events. Not all rainfall events. It's been designed to have the capacity, the storage capacity to temporarily store the water quality volume as required by the guidance in the Connecticut DEP Stormwater Quality Manual, the water quality volume for the contributing catchment area that drains to it, the groundwater recharge volume, also a hydrologic sizing criteria of Connecticut DEP Stormwater Quality Manual, and the runoff capture volume, which is equivalent to the water quality volume and is, as we talked about, needs to be captured and retained on the site because our stormwater discharge is within 500 feet of a tidal wetland. Tidal wetland being that associated with Fence Creek on the east side of East Wharf. In addition to meeting those three hydrologic sizing criteria in the Connecticut Stormwater Quality Manual, we also are, and I have not specifically mentioned this, but we have made the storage reservoir below the ground large enough, have a large enough capacity to store the runoff volume from a 5-year rainfall event. That means we store the runoff volume for a 2-year rainfall event. And that's important because another hydrologic sizing criteria in the Stormwater Quality Manual is channel protection, the control of the 2-year storm event for stream channel protection. We are actually storing temporarily and infiltrating the 2-year, the runoff from the 2-year event. So we meet the requirements of the Connecticut Stormwater Quality Manual for those 4 hydrologic sizing criteria: water quality volume, groundwater recharge volume, annual groundwater recharge volume, runoff capture volume, and stream channel protection volume. In addition, we've analyzed our drainage area. We've done a comparison of peak rates of discharge for both the existing condition and the developed condition. And if you look at the stormwater management report, there's very small increases in each of the storm events. I believe they range between 0.4 of a cubic foot per second to 0.9 of a cubic foot per second. We provided that analysis. Madison, I think this is important to understand and to get into the record. The town of Madison's regulations the town does not have a 0 increase in peak rate of discharge requirement. The regulations say an analysis should be done, but there is no requirement like other towns, other municipalities, to reduce the peak rates of discharge in the developed condition to the existing condition. It's my opinion that our increases are so small and our drainage area is so small, it's about 1/2 acre, compared to the overall drainage area to the wetland, which would appear to be somewhere between 4 and 5 acres, the best we can estimate. Town doesn't have topographic mapping, but from the state's LIDAR-based ground surface elevation data, it would appear that the drainage area to that wetland is some 4 to 5 acres. So it's our opinion it's my opinion as a professional engineer, that the increases in peak rates of discharge will not cause a problem downstream. They will not cause a problem with the culvert beneath East Wharf Road. I should also tell you that I have been out there during and after significant rainfall events and stood at the property line. Best I could tell by looking, standing at the property line, surface water does not pond to any significance in the offsite wetland to the southeast. There are minor pockets of ponding, like everywhere, that would appear to be a couple inches deep and 5 to 10 square feet in area, but there is no overall ponding in that wetland. In other words, the wetland, the best I can tell from standing on the property boundary, that offsite wetland does not provide a stormwater detention function. In other words, it doesn't temporarily store stormwater to any significant depth or quantity. I've gone, after standing at the property boundary, I've driven down East Wharf Road and got out and looked at the culvert, and the stream flow through the culvert is significant and continuous. The drainage area to that culvert is a minimum of 8 acres. It may be even larger. So the overall drainage area to that culvert inlet is twice the size of the drainage area to the wetland. Any questions there? I think just the last thing I'd like to say is, I think it was Lee Schumacher asked about the quantity of fill required for the stormwater infiltration system. So just roughly, it would appear to be, I think conservatively, about 200 cubic yards. I need to say for the record, there's no requirement to do earthwork volumes for this application. So we have not done that for the overall site. But I did take a look at what would be required for that infiltration system. I think, unless there's any questions, I think that covers what I wanted to say.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
I was looking through the plans and I just wondered, a lot of these infiltration systems, and I'm clearly not an expert, but what is there a maintenance plan? So scrolling through the plans, it has something on page, I don't know what, I just lost it. Just a sec. Where it says that inspection shall be made after each storm event and periodically during prolonged rainfall, repair or replacement shall be made as required. Is this during construction, or is this just part of what will happen? And who might be doing that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Were you looking at the plans or the
Yeah.
stormwater management report?
Not the stormwater management report. This is on the
okay.
plans. Just because I'm interested in the, we talk about maintenance, it's great to have all these structures, but then the maintenance of them and where the snow goes and all of that we talk about often in this committee. So I was just curious as to the maintenance of this structure.
Okay, so I think what you were probably reading from was the erosion and sediment control notes sheet. Probably there's a narrative there about inspection of erosion and sediment controls, but so that's during construction and until all disturbed areas are stabilized. But post construction, when everything is all done, there's a general operation and maintenance plan, pretty standardly required now for stormwater management systems and site operations. It's included as an appendix in the stormwater management report, and it talks about things like making sure the inlet structure grade is free of debris, cleaning out sediment in its sump, making sure the pipe is clear and free flowing, opening the access ports to the subsurface stormwater management system, making sure there's not extended ponding for a long time, meaning something would be wrong, because, you know, it's designed to just temporarily pond, that kind of thing. That's the kind of, I mean, this systems are very, very simple, but that's the kind of maintenance that would be required.
Mike,
Okay.
Mike, could I ask a question along? I just today read that document that you were just referring to. What's the organization, and I know it's not an engineering issue, that's going to ensure that this maintenance plan is done?
I think Chris could, I don't know if that's set in stone yet, but Chris might be able to, Chris McCann might be able to speak to that.
Okay, I think it's a pretty detailed plan. There's a lot in there. I just don't know if it's going to get done.
It might, Chris, I don't know if you can hear, I think you're muted, but it possibly could be a homeowners association or some kind of entity like that, but Chris should
Okay.
answer that one.
Okay, I'd just like to know that.
Yeah, I can speak to that. And part of what I was going to talk to the agency about tonight are conditions that sort of naturally flow from what we've presented as our entire application. But John Cunningham's letter indicates that the organic protocol for the garden and lawn could be worked into the homeowners association. That condition is something that is utilized in the planning and zoning context and has been used in the planning and zoning context, for instance, as recently as the General's Residence project, that the homeowners association implement rules and regulations that support the approvals. So for instance, the organic fertilizer pesticide program, we should the agency approve our application, as we hope you will, a condition that the fertilizer pesticide program be incorporated into the rules and regulations of the association governing the site, assuming it isn't just the owner that is going to be operating the site. It is possible that these units would be built and owned by one owner, and therefore there would be no association. I don't think that's likely, but it's possible. But to answer your question, it can be a condition of approval that the maintenance recommendations for the stormwater management system and the pesticide and fertilizer requirements of the garden and lawn areas of the site be organic. Those are conditions we would be prepared to accept as part of an approval, and is probably a good idea to address the very issue you're raising. How do we make sure they get implemented?
So are you basically saying that currently you don't have a plan to implement that? I mean, I know it's in the stormwater plan, but you don't have someone who's going to maintain these structures for stormwater, but you'd be willing to consider that as a condition?
After the project is built, I think the question is directed toward who's going to make sure that it gets done.
Right.
And that is the case. That is the case with every application and every approval. There are certain ongoing maintenance responsibilities, and a condition of approval would be that the recommended maintenance and operation plans for the infrastructure system, the fertilizer and pesticide protocol is in fact maintained. And if it isn't, then they'd be in violation of their permit. So that's the case with many applications. If the owner or applicant doesn't do what the approval requires them to do, then an enforcement action could be brought.
Yes, no, I understand. I think what Lee was asking is, it was more just, did you already have what was already planned? But that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. So any other questions for Mike? Oh,
I just have just very briefly, unless there's any questions, I just want to say two quick things, I think. One is Attorney McCann asked me to, the town planner, Dave Anderson, submitted two comments or questions maybe from a property owner or resident. One had to do with the rainfall depths that we used in our hydrologic modeling, and one had to do with how we sized the pump chambers for the septic systems. So just really quickly, what I should say for the record is that we used the appropriate rainfall depths from the appropriate source that all practicing engineers use in doing hydrologic modeling. Be glad to have a more lengthy discussion with that person about it, but I'll just say that for the record. And with regard to the wastewater effluent pump stations, they are not sized for long-term, days-long power outages. They are the state public health department technical standards for subsurface sewage disposal systems requires that they be designed to have an emergency storage volume at least equivalent to the 24-hour design flow. So if the wastewater design flow, I'm making this up, if the wastewater design flow from a building is 350 gallons per day, you have to make sure that when the high level alarm goes off in the pump station, I'll explain in a minute, that there's a whole day's wastewater flow storage volume above that alarm level. You don't design wastewater pump stations for, I think the letter said 5 days of power outage. The pump stations have to have an audible and visual alarm in the building to indicate to the property owner that there's a problem with the pumps. And the property owner would then, if they exceed their 1 day storage before it's fixed, they have to have a wastewater contractor come and pump out the pump station just like they do septic tanks. So hopefully that answers both of those questions. I also want to make sure that the agency members have read the response letter. There's a lot of comments that have been made. Some of them, with all due respect, are I believe to be incorrect. I will. This is the last thing I will say. I learned a long time ago when somebody questions something I do in a design, sometimes I think, am I getting old and I've been doing this so long that I haven't kept up with today's standards? Has something changed? So I make a phone call. And I double check my understanding. And that's what I've done here. There's several comments in here that made me think, I know what my understanding is, but let me double check it, and I have. And that includes the fact that the wastewater systems are not under the review and approval authority of the state. They are with the local health department. We do not have to design the wastewater systems using Connecticut DEP criteria. The subsurface stormwater infiltration system is not regulated under the EPA underground injection control program for the protection of water supply resources. It is regulated locally by the municipality. That is, I think that concludes what I have to say. I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have.
great. Are there any other questions for Mr. Ott? Are there any more people for the app? Oh, Joe, yes.
Yep. Just one question for Mike. Say the proposal gets built, you can say that there will be a lot less pollutants and stormwater leaving the property than is happening today.
No, I can't say that, Joe, honestly, because if you think about it, good question. I'm sorry you asked it, but I got to give you an honest answer. If you think about it, you cannot increase impervious land surface cover and make a statement that you will have less stormwater runoff, meaning volume. There's always a volume increase, but volume is not, there are only certain instances in which volume is regulated. If you recall, we've taken care of the applicable volume criteria through the water quality volume, the groundwater recharge volume, the runoff capture volume, as well as the 2-year channel protection rainfall event. So you can't actually, if you think about it, no project can say yes to that question about stormwater runoff volume unless they are lucky enough to have a sand and gravel geology with a deep water table and a deep depth to bedrock where all stormwater runoff could be put in the ground and never leave the site. That is not what we have here. And as I'm sure you all know, that is highly unusual in the town of Madison, except down at the beach for the most part, or up at the subdivision on Horse Pond that's under construction right now. It's all beautiful sand, and it's up high, and there's a very deep water table and a very significant depth of bedrock. So it's pretty unusual that you'd be able to answer yes to that question.
But you did
Okay,
it in such a
thank
good
you.
way.
Oh, it's the truth if you think about it.
Gosh, I know.
It's physics.
I know. It was a good way to say yes. Okay. So is there anybody else speaking for the applicant?
We have one more speaker, and that's David Lord, who has a few brief comments.
Okay.
You're on mute, David.
I'll say that again. Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the commission and general public. I do have a few comments that I would like to make in response to issues and questions that were raised at our last session. Let me preface my comments. Mike's already touched on this, but I will also. I myself have not entered onto any adjacent properties or been able to fully respond to the issues and questions raised in a manner which would be generally accepted in trying to form a response to some of those questions. With that in mind, a couple points that I would like to make. There was one comment or a series of comments about stating that I stated on the record that my professional opinion, there is, I believe there to be no likelihood for adverse impacts. Things along those lines in terms and couched in terms such as should or don't believe. It's important to understand that wetland science is not a computational science. We do not measure and say 50 feet is the dividing line between good development and problem development. Nothing magically happens at any point or line that we draw on a particular piece of property. What we do in rendering professional opinions is base it on the existing character of the subject property, the existing character of the adjacent properties, and the level of protective measures which are incorporated into the site plan drawings. Such terms as current standards of practice are used along with my 43 years of experience with wetlands and watercourse resources. I was supposed to start with a little bit of background in my educational, so I will give it to you now. I have an undergraduate degree in natural environmental systems. I have a master's degree in soil science, and I have been practicing in the field of soils and wetland science for 43 years. Of that time, there was about 8 years in the state of Illinois. The rest of the time was in the state of Connecticut. I've been a consulting soil scientist since 1987 in Connecticut. Those are the means by which you state your professional opinion based on those criteria, reference materials that are generally accepted by the science, wetland regulations where they are, and enough on that particular subject. There was a comment made about looking for or that there's a potential vernal pool in adjacent properties to this site. Again, obviously, I was not able to investigate physically those areas to determine definitively whether or not there were vernal pools on adjacent properties. There are obviously none on the subject property. Spring peepers are very readily, numerously mentioned in proceedings, especially at this time of the year. Vernal pools are generally referred to as a facultative vernal pool species, meaning that, yes, they do use vernal pools, but based on their maturation process, they also will breed in wooded swamps and which have shallow pools or low hummocky type wetlands. Obligate species are ones that only use vernal pools. They have actually adapted specific life cycle patterns to vernal pool characteristic areas. Those are the spotted salamanders, marbled salamanders, wood frogs, and one with a very interesting name, fairy shrimp, are considered obligate species. But you have to be on site over a period of time in order to make that type of a determination. Let's see, the other point that I'll make regarding habitat in general, and that can be found on the photos which I have attached to my report. The last photograph, which shows some of the drainage patterns in the general area. You can see the density of development, the density of impervious surfaces in the general area contributing to the wetlands, which we're referring to as the southeast wetland relative to this project. Those areas which have grass lawns, impervious surfaces, parking areas, other impervious surfaces existingly are adjacent to any potential vernal pool habitat or even the subject wetland that we are talking about. Lastly is the comment that was made concerning the cumulative impact should be considered when evaluating this particular project. Again, if you look on pages or photographs 1 and 2 attached to the report, you'll see an indication of generalized flow patterns. Mr. Hosley's already talked about the drainage area begins up at Bushnell Lane, flows down to the area just to the west of the existing tennis court. In some manner, that flow goes around, through, or under the tennis court. We've heard some mention of a pipe, drainage pipe in association with the tennis court. And then it continues in a south-southwesterly manner before it discharges into a culvert in East Wharf Road. The pipe is probably just a comment about that. I was not able to take a look at that drainage pipe. Don't know exactly what its function is, but based on the surrounding topography, it's pretty clear that that is to take the water from the west end of the tennis court and direct it to the eastern side of the tennis court, much in the manner it appears to have been the original flow pattern for this, I'll just try to say the right term, syncline in this portion of the part of Madison. The final comment that I'll make, I believe I've covered all of the, yes. There is a conclusion statement. I'll read that. This development as currently proposed does not represent a likelihood for adverse environmental impacts to the associated wetland watercourse resources or their long-term functioning at present levels. This directly relates to statewide inland wetland regulations. It's been adjudicated, if that's the right term, and has been found to be the standard for a criteria in deliberating a particular wetland application. And lastly, I'll just read another statement. As a commissioner, all of the members should feel comfortable with the level of protective measures incorporated into this site plan, that there will be no adverse impacts to the functioning of the southeastern wetland now or in the long-term post-completion. And with that, I will conclude and attempt to answer any questions that anyone may have. Thank you.
Any questions for Mr. Lord?
No.
No? Okay. All right. Well, if that is the last from the applicant, is that right?
I have a number of comments, but I'd like to just save my comments for wrapping up and concluding the public hearing.
Okay, well, all right. Okay, well, we should hear from the intervener. Yes, Mr. Hosley, did you have a question?
I do. If I could share screen again, see if I can do this. Can you see my list of blasting permits in Madison?
Yes.
Wonderful. I did a little research and realized that in the 98 years that we've been in the explosives industry, we have worked on a majority of these jobs and or bid on them. And as a result of that firsthand experience, referring to some information from other individuals in our company, I have gained the conclusion that these projects are well over 500 cubic yards in rock volume, supported by the rock quantities associated with these permits. So I know I stumbled with that a little bit, but I just wanted to clarify that. So thank you for that opportunity.
You're welcome. Thank you for the information. Okay, so I think it's, we're going to try to not be up all night. So we'll move on to the intervener. Mr. Ainsworth, are you going to speak?
Yes, I am present. Thank you. So, I mean, we certainly would like the opportunity to hear everything the applicant has to say. So I hope there's no new information after this that we're not able to rebut. But I'll start from the top, and then I'm going to introduce the team that the interveners have put together, which is George Logan from REMA Environmental, Steve Trinkus, who is a professional engineer and low impact development specialist, and Jeff Sissel, who is our blasting consultant. But I'll start by just making a few comments of my own. I've been in no particular order because I was making these notes as in real time. But I noticed that there was a number of comments about the tennis court. The current owner of the Ledges property was the previous owner of the tennis court, and has full knowledge that that tennis court is made of permeable material. And I don't know whether they installed it or not, but certainly they have plenty of knowledge of it. Mr. Lord also mentioned, he said, wetland science is not an exact science. I suppose in some regards it's a qualitative science, but certainly one can calculate pollutant loads. One can calculate cumulative impacts, loads over time. One can enumerate the current condition of downstream water quality. One can look at, can quantify the distribution of species, the sensitivity of those species to certain runoff water quality characteristics, sodium, nutrients, that sort of thing. So there are certainly quantifiable aspects to wetland scientists, to wetland science. I myself have a Bachelor of Science in biology, and actually drafted the model wetlands bylaws for the state of Massachusetts or Commonwealth before I moved to Connecticut. So I have some personal knowledge in my own background, as well as my 30 years of doing environmental law. And there were a number of comments about from the applicant's team, and I'll be very brief about this, but I do think I have to mention it, that they weren't allowed to have access. My clients did provide the Ledges team with a copy of Remo Ecological's wetlands delineation at its own expense. And Mr. Logan is here to answer those questions. But that report, by the way, has a map or a photographic image with overlays on it with a scale. So it is really possible for someone to have drafted a wetlands upland review area boundary on their site plan, which I don't believe still exists. For at least the southeast wetland, not the southwest. That's always been there for the southwest one. And so my clients did provide that information and that report, and its map is available. Now, is it a mapped wetland in the technical sense that that map has been filed with the town of Madison? No, but it's data that was submitted in the course of this process. And then the Ledges experts previously had access, specifically Mr. Hosley, previously trespassed on the Gagnon and Downs properties when he was asked by either Mr. Downs or Mr. Gagnon, I forget which, what he was doing. He replied that he was reviewing the wetlands for the town. When he was pressed on that misrepresentation, he indicated he was working for the Ledges engineer to examine the wetlands. Now, I don't think that may be entirely true because he's a blasting engineer, but certainly they had a previous access to the property, which is why we didn't provide additional access to the property. Bill Pite and Ms. Whitehead previously owned the relevant portion of the Downs property and have familiarity with that site. So it's not as though they haven't had access to it. And then the Ledges apparently may have had access to the wetlands data because there were, when Mr. Logan did his work, and he can confirm this, that there were fresh wetlands probe holes taken in the Gagnon's wetlands at the time of Mr. Hosley's unauthorized visit. Whether it was Mr. Hosley who did that or somebody else, I don't know. But certainly nobody else on the Gagnon side of things did that. So I just wanted to make that note. And there's been this talk about this fertilizer and maintenance frequency protocol. Those protocols have not been defined. And I think that's important to note that there is no organic fertilizer pesticide protocol. I mean, a protocol suggests that there's actual standards that could be applied. It suggests that there are actually recommendations on how to do it, volumes, concentrations, amounts, frequency. None of that is in the record. It's to be determined later. What I'm suggesting is that's a standardless condition, that the applicant is essentially saying that we've got this organic fertilizer protocol that will be enforced perhaps by the homeowners association, perhaps by the town. I don't know how the town would ever know what was going on because there's no reporting system. So in a practical sense, it's completely unenforceable. In addition, I do want to make a comment about organic fertilizer. The environmental benefits of organic fertilizer are not so much in the fact that they're applied, but it's in the fact that they're not processed in the same way that synthetic fertilizers and pesticides are processed. The manufacturing of them is quite environmentally harmful. And so organic processing using organic materials is actually beneficial. But nitrates, the molecules of nitrates are exactly the same for an organic fertilizer as they are for a synthetic fertilizer. They're indistinguishable. So nutrient loading and eutrophication effects from organic fertilizers is a problem, especially since organic fertilizers tend to be more similar to a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio for, as in fertilizer. In other words, PKN, phosphorus, potassium, and or potash, and nitrogen, and because of that, if you're applying enough nitrogen to fertilize your plants, you're actually probably over phosphating them, and therefore creating a likelihood of phosphate runoff. So organic fertilizers can actually be problematic in and of themselves. An organic fertilizer program isn't necessarily, just by invoking that term, isn't a magic bullet. And then I'd like to also say here that our law, our Connecticut Wetlands law, the River Sound case, and that is, I should probably cite that appropriate. The River Sound cases versus Inland Wetlands Commission, 122 Con App 644 2010 case, basically stands for the proposition that wetlands impacts that impact or negatively impact the physical properties of a wetlands outside the upland review area are still regulated. In other words, the upland review area of 100 feet isn't a hard and fast line in the soil that just says you can't look beyond that. If there are resulting physical impacts to a downstream water resource, that you can actually regulate that. And that, of course, is consistent with Aaron versus Conservation Commission, 183 Con 547, which basically, among many other things, stands for the proposition that wetlands to impacts can come from outside the physical boundaries of a wetlands or a watercourse. Let's see, where else did we go here? Okay, so I'd like to say also that under section 10.3 of your regulations, which basically said, and I'm paraphrasing very closely though, in the case of an application where which received a public hearing pursuant to a finding that the proposed activity may have a significant impact, not will, but may have a significant impact on wetlands or watercourses, a permit shall not be issued unless the agency finds on the basis of the record that a feasible and prudent alternative does not exist. Now, first, the applicant has made an argument that you didn't make that finding. Ironically enough, because the applicant failed to provide sufficient information. We've had a lot of supplemental information over the course of several months. So at the time you called for the public hearing, interesting enough, the applicant had deprived you of the information necessary to be able to fully make that finding. Although I suspect you suspected that there might be a problem because there was a wetland that they had not identified on their plans. We identified it as interveners, or neighbors identified it for the applicant and for the commission. That's the southeast wetland. And so one can't deprive a commission of necessary information and then try to utilize that to your own benefit and say, you couldn't possibly have determined that there may have been an impact. And frankly, you can't make that determination that's required in your regulations unless the applicant presents a feasible and prudent alternative, because how can you possibly analyze whether a feasible prudent alternative exists or is sufficient unless you actually have it or have multiples of them? And the commission actually suggested at one point that one might be reducing the units. That comes to mind as a particularly obvious potential solution, which is you've got as many units as you could possibly have on this site. You cannot fit any more. It's not possible to put more units on this site without a zoning variance. So having maximized their economic opportunities, one might assume that a reasonable, feasible, prudent alternative would be removing either one of units 4, 5, 6, or 7, and thereby providing more physical availability of land to be able to do, let's say, a biofilter, a vegetated biofilter to handle the stormwater that is currently going completely untreated into a stormwater system that discharges it to an area that has known fairly shallow bedrock and is directly upstream from a receiving wetland, which is directly upstream from a receiving salt marsh. So with that as an introduction, I'd like to introduce Mr. Steve Trinkus, who you've heard from before. And Steve, if you would just state your general qualifications for the commission. And, then
good
your
evening,
comments.
members of the commission and public. My name is Stephen Trinkus. I'm a licensed professional engineer in Connecticut since 1988. I reside in Southbury, Connecticut, where I have my office. In addition to performing land development services for roughly 40 years, I'm an expert in the field of low impact development, which is a focus on runoff volume and water quality generated by development projects. A couple quick comments regarding wetland impacts. The stormwater management system proposed by the applicant is basically a catch basin structure to collect water from the driveway and put it into an underground gallery system. As was pointed out last meeting, the southeastern end of the gallery system is basically, the bottom of it is at existing grade. It is being filled around with. While we have a volume of fill, we do not know the type of fill or how it will be installed. On the northwestern end, the opposite end, toward the existing driveway, the end of that is about 4 feet below grade. But the southeastern end is more the concern, because if you look at the test pit logs in the stormwater report by the applicant, you've got up to 24 inches of either topsoil and or sandy loam. And the plans do not call whether that material is going to be removed or if you're just setting the gallery on top of it. Well, I think everybody would acknowledge that sand and gravel can dissipate a lot of water. Loamy soils are more of a question. We do not have any infiltration tests to prove what the infiltration rates are of the sandy loam soils and or the sand and gravel. While the applicant has stated that this, the runoff capture volume, the groundwater recharge volume, and the channel protection volume will be fully infiltrated, there's no analysis to prove that will actually occur. And as they are calling out in the stormwater report that they are not going to use de-icing agents, at least sodium chloride based ones. There are other ones such as magnesium acetate, but those are about 4 to 5 times more expensive than sodium chloride. Again, this is private property. It is extremely likely that you will be using sodium chloride on the site. I think it's impossible to enforce a provision that they cannot use it, because a homeowner, if he has ice outside his driveway, is going to want to spread some rock salt there to melt the ice. That's the reality. So if we are not going to use de-icing agents, you're going to be using sand for traction on the paved surface. As the inlet structure has no storage below the pipe going to the underground gallery system, it is likely you're going to get sand being discharged to the infiltration system, which will build up on the bottom of the system of the native soils there, and that can clog it over time, which completely renders the assumptions made of how water is going to infiltrate, pretty much throws them right out the window. Additionally, there is no pre-treatment of the runoff from the impervious area, and as the applicant stated, you have an increase in pavement, you will have an increase in pollutant loads. That's reality. There is no pre-treatment, and under the EPA Class 5 injection wells, if you have pre-treatment, then the system is not considered an injection well. However, there is no pre-treatment in this particular case. So pollutants from the driveways and even from the roof areas, we get about 40% of our nutrient loads via atmospheric deposition. You don't see it happening, but it falls on your driveway, on your roof, and washes off with the next rainstorm, will be directly discharged to the underground gallery system. While water moves quickly through sand and gravel, minimal, if any, treatment ever occurs within the sand and gravel because the water is moving so quickly through it. It is not uncommon for sand and gravel soils to have infiltration rates of 150 to 200 feet per day. And that is going to follow the topographic gradient generally and go down, go downhill. That's what water does. but the sand and gravel does not provide treatment. It's the same condition when we do a septic system in raising it in sand and gravel. The sand and gravel is simply to spread the effluent out. It is the native organic soil under the select fill that provides the attenuation of pollutants within septic effluent. Similarly, that is the same condition that occurs here. And we don't have that. We're basically dumping water into a very permeable pot. It's going to run away, and there's not going to be treatment of that runoff. Ultimately, that water will get down to down gradient wetlands. And while it's a small site, over time, the concentration of pollutants, particularly metals and hydrocarbons from the movement of cars in and out. I mean, we have one house now, and we're going to have several more houses here. So you will have a lot more cars in and out. The assumption would also be you're going to have some more, FedEx trucks and UPS trucks coming in and out than you would at the present time. So you will have increased pollutant loads that will be discharged to the gallery system, will move through the groundwater, and ultimately reach down gradient wetlands. And over time, both metals and hydrocarbons pose a lot of adverse impacts, primarily to the benthic aquatic organisms, the bottom of the food chain that reside in our aquatic systems. Regarding the applicant's statement earlier that, well, we have spot elevations and we're going to direct the water around the edge of the grass versus the edge of the pavement. That's nice in theory, and having done this for 40 years, I will tell you it doesn't work in reality at all. The water will find one low spot and that's where it will go. And so if you're depending on a grass shoulder to direct the water to the inlet structure, it's not going to get there. It's going to go where it wants to go. So it's not going to be discharged to that system. When you're trying to convey water to a treatment system, you really need a curb or some other structure to convey the water where you want it to go. There is no pre-treatment, as I said before. There needs to be pre-treatment, ideally some type of vegetated lid system that can remove both particulate and soluble pollutants. Both metals and hydrocarbons come in both forms, as do nutrients. So you need to have systems that can remove both of them. Mechanical systems such as hydrodynamic separators do not. You need some type of vegetated system to really attenuate them. And without that, there will be a high reasonable risk of pollutants ultimately reaching down gradient wetlands over time from the stormwater management system. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trinkus. So I'd like to introduce George Logan to follow up on the wetlands comments and dovetailing with Mr. Trinkus.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for your patience with all this. And, I realized the other day that I did not put my qualifications into the record. Usually I put my professional resume. So let me say a few things. I do have a bachelor's degree of Bachelor in Science and Natural Resources Science with concentrations in wetlands, wildlife, and soils. I also have a master's degree of science in conservation biology, and specifically in endangered species, believe it or not. I've been working in this field for about 34 years. And since 1996, I've been the principal environmental scientist with REMA Ecological Services. I have several certifications as a professional wetland scientist, as a certified senior ecologist, and also, of course, as a soil scientist. And again, my concentration was wetlands and wildlife, so that's kind of a lot of my expertise is in that. What I like to do is to there's several areas that I like to talk about. I will continue the conversation that we just heard from Mr. Trinkhaus, and without repeating what he said, voice my own opinion as an environmental scientist as to my concerns about the proposed stormwater management system. One thing that I did was just interesting is I looked at the test pits. Now, if you look at the plans, what you realize quickly is that you have an assumed elevation, probably 100, and then went off that. The actual topography, if you look at the state GIS topography that was flown in 2016, you notice that test pit 14, there's actually 3 test pits in a row almost, 15, 14, and 9. 9 is the one that's the closest to the offsite wetland, if you will, and it's the bottom system of the infiltration. So if you look at 9, the elevation there is about 26, the real elevation. Again, plus or minus 1 foot, and I'm looking off the GIS, the state GIS. Refusal was reached at 7 feet, plus or minus. That means that it's at 19 feet, we hit probably bedrock. And that is above the offsite wetland. The offsite wetland is at about elevation 13 to 16. And I'll explain that in a moment. If you go up gradient from test pit 9 to test pit 14, the elevation there is about 28. The refusal is about 8 feet, and therefore the refusal is at 20. Again, that's above the wetland. So you have one that's 20 and one that's 19. And interestingly enough, the one that's further up is the refusal is at 20 feet, whereas the next one is 19. That kind of gives you an idea of which way the water is going. Both these test pits in the bottom layers or strata, it notes that there are sands and gravels, a little silt here and there, or sands. So again, this appear to be a outwash deposit here that's between the ledges, if you will. And it looks like the groundwater flow, and as we were told earlier by Mr. Horsley, is that there's an aqueduct there that confines the groundwater. So once the groundwater, the water from our infiltration system hits that aqueduct, it will continue going in a southeasterly direction towards the wetland, which interestingly enough, when I was out there delineating the wetland, and you can, I probably should have shown you some pictures, but one of the things you will see is that there's boulders and rocks around. And I determined that that particular wetland belonged to the Ridgebury-Leicester-Whitman soil complex. So Sears complex, mostly Ridgebury-Leicester. I didn't find any very poorly drained Whitman there. But what you realize is that this is a seasonal discharge wetland. So what I'm trying to say with all this is the water that's going to infiltrate into these fairly fast soils, it's going to eventually hit that wetland and express itself, particularly in the early growing season, but also later on. When I was out there, and I did a little calculation because I remember that there was actually water that was running through the system, and there was water close to the surface, irrespective of the fact that there was a pipe that was also discharging. But the fact that the pipe was discharging kind of was interesting. It meant that that was groundwater for the most part. And I looked back about 7 days, actually 8 days from February 25th, which was when I was out there, to see how much rain we had gotten. And in 8 days, we got 0.35 inches, and it was all spread out. So that's not a lot of rain. So that was, in all likelihood, groundwater that was being intercepted. What I like to do is to share my screen, if that's okay with you folks, and see if this works. Maybe I'll have a little better luck than Mr. Horsley. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Oh, well, we'll start with this. Can you all see what I'm seeing?
Yes.
Okay. Actually, let me go to figure A. I think that's, again, each one of these little contours that I'm pointing to is a 1 foot contour. This is a 40. That means this is a 30, and this is a 20. So that's how I determine where we are as far as the infiltration system, which will be up in this area, versus where the wetland is. And since we were talking, I had the other figure up. I just made this up just a little while ago. There's a couple of reasons for putting this up. First, here's the wetland that I delineated in here. Of course, it has the ditch that goes out. Here's the tennis court. I know that you can see it underneath. So the wetland is here. And that's more or less the watershed, plus or minus. Again, that was pretty quick. Here's a house, there's a house. You can see that there's no house, there's a house here. There's the top of the slope, there's another house here. So yes, there are some houses that are part of this watershed. And of course you have another wetland on the other side of the tennis court. But I think the take home is that there's a lot of upland, and because of the topography of this particular area, it appears that the majority of the watershed is actually undeveloped or is not pervious. So that kind of gives you an idea of, what this wetland is receiving under existing conditions and what it will receive in the future. Here's some other things that I wanted to show you. Oops, boy, this is too big. Sorry about that. Okay, I think that's better. Again, this is something that I put together some time ago. As you can see, the research that was done back then was the NERP UCPA information that was gathered by these folks. Obviously, things might have changed a little bit, but not to any great extent. And what I wanted to show you here is the percent dissolved fraction of these heavy metals, which are all obviously toxic. We don't have so much of a concern with lead anymore because of the fact that we don't use leaded gasoline, but the other ones are still in the environment. And as you can see, there's a majority of, in some cases, more than 50% of a particular heavy metal. And again, a lot of it has to do with the pH that you find in the soils. So if in the acidic soils, you have more dissolved stuff, and in basic soils, you don't. Actually, it's the other way around. Sorry about that. Here's something else, a typical distribution of dissolved particulate runoff fractions, and you have your nitrogen and your phosphorus. And again, you can kind of see how much percent dissolved fraction. TSS are obviously 0. And then again, similar numbers to what you saw before. And this was just a graphic to show the red is the dissolved and the blue is the particulate. So I think that's all I want to share for the screen. I'll stop sharing. So again, my professional opinion is that because there is no pretreatment, and Mr. Trinkhaus hit it on the nail on the head, is you have to have vegetation and soil microbiology in order to have any chance of doing something with a dissolved fraction of these pollutants. And I'm not even mentioning here refractory organics, which is the pesticides and the herbicides, which are also an issue, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So it's my professional opinion that there's going to be a concentration of these pollutants down to said wetland that we're talking about, the one that I delineated, and that will have an unreasonable impact upon that particular wetland. And yes, there is a cumulative impact that happens because we're talking about concentrations here. And some of these pollutants actually concentrate in the environment. They just don't flush through. They start concentrating. And we've known that for quite some time, which is an issue in many aquatic systems. Now, talking about pesticides and herbicides, and I was honestly hoping for a little more from our landscape architect, as far as just a quick statement that organic fertilizers are going to be used doesn't really exactly cut it for me, because it's not really what you put down, including the pesticides and herbicides, but it's how you put it down and how much you put down. So typically in situations where we have a sensitive receptor down gradient, which is this wetland, and of course, going downstream all the way to the salt marsh, one of the things that I've usually recommended, and one of my associates is actually accredited in this, is to use landscaping people that have the NOFA accreditation certification. And NOFA, as you probably have heard before, is the Northeast Organic Farming Association. And in Connecticut, what they've done is they've allowed, through an educational program, for people to learn a lot of things about how to actually use these organic fertilizers and what other techniques one can use that don't make sure you don't rely on pesticides and herbicides, but other kinds of treatments. So that's kind of what we need for something like this, in my opinion. Obviously, especially if it's going to be homeowners association, is to use a NOFA accredited or certified organic lawn care professional, and not just, we're going to just put some organic fertilizers on. That doesn't cut it. You need a program. You need to be able to show what it is you're going to do. I noticed that I don't think, at least that's the way I'm looking at it right now, I don't think we have a final answer as to what exactly is happening in the so-called garden area. I mean, yes, okay, we have a better idea of, we're going to have some raised beds, and we're going to have some stone, a few inches of that underneath, which the stone is permeable. But what's underneath that? And when the house is removed, one of the questions that I had, well, maybe we can't go and drill a hole right now in the house and find out what's underneath. That's unreasonable, but at least there should have been a protocol of some sort that says, when we remove the house and we're going to test the soil, we're going to do X, Y, Z, and based on that, we're going to have a program or some standards that we're going to follow to make sure that in the process of removing the house, and we do not end up contaminating the wetlands that are adjacent, actually on both sides, both the one that I delineated and the one that I mapped that you saw in figure 1. I think I'm almost done. Yeah, I'm pretty much done. So again, from kind of synthesizing all what I've seen, what I've heard so far today, I think that I could definitely say that the project presents the reasonable likelihood of unreasonable impact to natural resources, including in the form of accumulated impacts, these cumulative impacts that I talked about. And this would happen over time. It wouldn't happen immediately, but it would happen over time. And with that, I will rest and see if you have any questions of me. Thank you.
Go ahead, Joe.
I have 2 questions, Kia. The second one's going to sound really dumb, but the first question. The Gagnons had a wetland delineated and it's never been mapped. And how come it's not on a map anywhere?
Oh, that's simple. So
why go through the process of coming up with a little boogeyman, which I'm not disagreeing exists, but put it on a map?
Okay, so as you probably know, most people, myself included, Mr. Lord included, and professionals in the field will do 2 things. They will rely, if they can immediately go off site, but unfortunately here, from what we've seen, there were some holes that were dug in that wetland vicinity. Who did it? We don't know. But they rely on existing mapping. And if you look at the mapping, and I could share it, you'll see that that particular area doesn't show wetland. So that's based on the old NRCS maps. So that's why we soil scientists have a job and a living. We go out and we specifically delineate wetlands that wouldn't have been picked up by the Natural Resources Survey, which the minimum unit, and Mr. Lord will probably could talk about that, the minimum unit in most cases of something that's a wet soil type is about 1.5 to 2 acres at best. And very often what you see sometimes is a little wet symbol, which we don't even know what that means. So a lot of these smaller wetlands are really not mapped by the federal government, by NRCS. So that's answers your first.
So there was no like borings taken and rock solidly saying this is where the wetland is. It's based on mapping.
No. I actually, oh, I see what you're saying. The NRCS, yes, the way they do it, I mean, some of these web soil surveys, which now are in the web, are decades old. And a lot of them have not been revised except to expand areas of urbanization and say, okay, now these no longer undisturbed soils are disturbed. So they're a combination of this, that, and the other thing. So yeah, what they did is they took maps of some sort and basically tried to map hundreds of acres sometimes at a time. And then they looked at aerial photographs and drew some lines. So, and they did it back for agricultural purposes way, decades ago. The Harford County Soil Survey, which I'm familiar with, was done was published in 1962, based on field work that was done in the 50s.
Okay, so there was a decision made to not officially map these.
Correct.
Now here's the dumb question.
There's no dumb
So
question.
if this wetland is 50 to 70 feet off the premises of Ms. Whitehead, and Keith's side is saying water's going to sheet off or come out of these infiltrators full of pollutants, and then you say the water's going to percolate down to this rock underground and shoot toward Fens Creek. Technically, it's going under the wetland. It's not polluting the wetland. Is
Well,
that feasible to say?
No, not really, because what you have is on the site, based on their own test pits, it looks like you have a sand and gravel deposit. No one's going to deny that. But if you look on all sides, you have basically shallow soils that are till dominated or bedrock influenced. When you get to said wetland that I delineated, what I delineated was a till deposit wetland, which if you go down, it's pretty tight. And you go further down, and what you notice is that you basically hit almost a compact layer of till in most cases. So what I'm saying is, as the water leaves the outwash, hits the bedrock, and then it comes down and hits the till deposits, which are several feet below. As I mentioned here, my wetland is at, what was it? My wetland is at 13 to 16 feet, whereas the infiltrator will be, the bedrock underneath the infiltrator is at 19 to 20 feet. And the surface is even higher than that. It's 26 to 28 feet or something along those lines. So I cannot prove this convincingly. I'm not going to try to pull the wool over anyone's eyes, but based on my professional experience, based on what I'm looking at, that I have before me, I know the water's coming down that way, and it's going to express itself, if it's not at the head portion of the wetland, somewhere down gradient of that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions for Mr. Logan? Okay. Keith Ainsworth, do you have anybody else who's going to speak? Because we do have the public that I want to make sure they have an opportunity.
Absolutely. Let me just ask if Mr. Jeff Sissel is on the call. I don't see him as a presenter, but he might have been on as a, and Dave Anderson might be able to.
I'm looking right now.
It would be under J. Sissel, I think.
No, I do not see him.
Okay. He had some travel this evening, so he might, I suspect that he might not be able to make it. So, but we've covered the territory we really need to cover. So I will defer to the public and allow them to have their say. But I'll just briefly comment that I believe that the application has sufficient deficiencies that it justifies a denial of the permit, and not an attempt to gloss over them with conditions that we don't know will work. I think we've pointed out enough of the gaps in data and some of the unstated assumptions that are unlikely to work. But I will leave it off to the public at this point to do their public comment. Thank you.
All right. Dave Anderson, do we have anybody from the public who has stayed up past 9 o'clock.
Yeah,
who
so
would
if
like to speak.
if any members of the public wish to speak, please raise your hand and I can unmute you. And I'll just ask you to please state your name and address for the record prior to beginning. So first hand up is Robin Phillips. Go ahead, Robin.
Thank you, Dave. Good evening, everybody. Robin Phillips. I live at 880 Boston Post Road. I'd like to just make two brief comments. One about blasting volumes and the second about the stormwater management system. And I will try to be brief here. So now that we have information on the amount of rock removal portrayed by Mr. Husley as minor, this actually seems major to me. The focus of the wetlands issue has been the blasting in the southwest corner of the property, which is now estimated at 78 cubic yards. And that's 180 tons of rock. So that doesn't seem minor to me. In fact, the total for the whole site is 407 cubic yards, as we see in the report, which is 930 tons in total. Now, when we teach kids in school how much a ton is, we say it's what an elephant weighs. So the blasting proposed on the property is the equivalent weight of 930 elephants. And another way that I looked at of thinking about the volume of 407 cubic yards is that it's equivalent to 14 school buses. And as you know, the volume of blasted rock after blasting is greater than the volume in situ. So depending on the detailed type of blasting, this means that we're carting away off this property, off-site, maybe 30 or as much as 40 school bus loads of rock. And all of this is going to change the topology of the land. So this is not a minor rock removal project by any stretch of the imagination. And the list Mr. Hosley showed us later doesn't provide the data that he claims. So I commented at the last meeting about the uncertainty in the project, and this proposal just increases the level of uncertainty in the project as a whole. This is not a minor rock removal project. And frankly, I don't understand why we haven't had any discussion of a proposal that provides an alternative to the problem. So I'd like to just move on to stormwater management and talk about trees. So as you know from your sidewalk, the back of the property is heavily wooded area. The stormwater management system report, just revised, is 59 pages long and very theoretical, with detailed tables and model outputs, which I actually found, Mr. Ott, I actually found very interesting. But we still don't have any information on which trees will be removed, how many, what type, and what size. And this is not mentioned in the report. Although we can surmise from the site plans that it will be a considerable number. So we have no way of calculating the additional groundwater present that won't be absorbed by the trees that are removed. And quite apart from the visual and wildlife impact of the tree removal, we therefore have no way of assessing the increased runoff and the adequacy of the stormwater management system that's proposed. Another uncertainty. So, you know, again on that theme, in my opinion, there's plenty of uncertainty about this project. Those are my remarks. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Any other members of the public wish to speak, please raise your hand. Okay. David Franks. David, you may need to unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm on mute now. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Just
All right.
again, please state your name and address for the record.
Will do. David Franks, 18 East Wharf Road. I've been a citizen of the great town of Madison for 25 years, and thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening. Just wanted to talk about some of the impact of the runoff that everyone talks about it from an inanimate position. At the end of this project, whether it's approved or not, there's people who have to live with those results. And those people are me. And I sent on March 1st photos of the runoff, as we call it, and the impact that it has on my property externally. Forget about the internal side, but externally. My house was built in 1923. And if you take a look at those photos that I submitted to the wetlands on March 1st, you will find that it's not a minor runoff that Mr. Ott asserts. And so that's something I would highly ask that the committee takes a look at, because at the end of all of this, I'm the one that has to live with this decision with all the experts making and then leave once it's approved. So I thank you for your time and your consideration.
Thank you. And if anyone else wishes to talk, please raise your hand. All right, we do. Peggy Zambrano.
Myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. My name is Peggy Zambrano. I live next door to the proposed project. And I just want to, again, remind the Inland Wetlands Commission that if you stand on my property, which is only 4 feet from the black garage, on 2 sides, you can see above ground ledge that travels all the way to the back wall of the garage. And so I, again, as others, am wondering what exactly is under the garage. If the above ground ledge is going to be impacted by fill that's brought in to raise duplex 4 and 5, where's the water going to go? That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? I'm not seeing any other hands.
Okay. All right. So, so we've heard from the applicant and we have heard from the intervener. Mr. McKean, I know, would like to speak again, but then I suspect that Mr. Ainsworth would like to speak again as well. This is a public hearing. It's not a courtroom. I am happy to have you both shortly, briefly speak, but then I would like to talk to the rest of the commission and see if anybody has questions and see if we can move this along.
My comments, if I may, are only in response to what we just heard. And the various experts may have minor points they want to address based on what we just heard as well. Typically, the intervener has presented their information, they've presented their case, we've heard from the public. The people in the public, I too am concerned for, which is why we have a team of professionals that spent countless hours looking at this site in much more detail than any of the neighbors or the public could have possibly done. We did so with a team of experts that have more experience collectively in front of this agency than anyone I know. In order to believe, if you will, the opposition, you would have to come to the conclusion that Rick Gosley, who I think we could all agree knows more about blasting than anybody, and John Cunningham, who has been designing landscape in this town for I don't know how long, but I've seen him at numerous commissions, meetings, public hearings. Mike Ott, 30 plus years. David Lord, 34 years as a soil scientist. They would have to be trying to pull the wool over the eyes of this agency. And that's just not the case. What they've presented to you is substantial evidence that the system that they have designed very carefully has no impact on the wetlands. Either one, the one to the southwest, which is mapped by our client years ago when they owned the property, and the newly mapped wetland area to the southeast, which was delineated by Mr. Logan, and we didn't contest it. We built our development to accommodate it, and it does accommodate it. And the professionals involved spent countless hours to make sure that it does. I have to address a number of points that Mr. Ainsworth made, and they include, first, the insinuation, if you will, that the tennis courts were on a property owned by my clients and ultimately sold to the interveners, with the implication being that they installed this drain pipe, which is directly draining surface water from the court to the wetland area. And the simple truth there is that neither Bill Pite nor Faith Whitehead, during their time of ownership, which by the way ended in 2008, never, ever installed that drainage pipe, and no permit was ever pulled. So we have a very likely scenario here where you have the interveners who are claiming that there is going to be an environmental impact based on the development we've proposed, who have a pipe draining from their tennis court to a wetland. That doesn't sound like concern to wetlands for me. We also heard information.
That's fine, but
Yeah.
I would really like to stay away from this personal
Madam
stuff.
Chair, I understand that, but we have a record to make. And
yes, but you are now insinuating back to the intervener and the back and forth. I really, if we can just stick to the wetlands issues and not talk about drain pipes and things that really aren't part of what we need to do. To talk
hear
about
you.
tonight.
With all due respect, draining water directly from a tennis court into a wetland is a wetlands issue.
I understand that, but it's actually off the site and it's not part of what we've talked about, right?
Both wetland areas are off-site. The issue of access to the site. The simple truth is there were at least 2 requests made by Ms. Whitehead to access the site to the Gagnons, and they were denied. After last meeting 2 weeks ago, we convened our team to address these issues and questions that came up at the last public hearing. We specifically requested access to the 2 off-site wetland areas so we could get information that many of the agency members asked for. We were denied that request. That is the truth of how that occurred. The biggest issue I need to address for the record is this issue of the citation of the Starble versus Inland Wetlands Commission and this notion that we have to provide a feasible and prudent alternative. And that is simply just not the case. First of all, when the application was received on February 8th, it is true that we had not had an official delineation of the wetlands to the southeast. But in fact, we had received a letter from the Gagnons, and the agency received a letter from the Gagnons, and there was potential concern for that area to the southeast containing wetlands. Mr. Newton raised the issue at that meeting that the letter from the Gagnons claimed it was wetlands. So at that point in time, whether or not it was wetlands, the agency knew what our proposal was, how generally we intended to address stormwater runoff through an infiltration system that ultimately would infiltrate to that wetland, as it does now. So it can't be said that that area was not known at the time. It was known at the time. And if you recall that hearing, we had discussion about whether or not to have a public hearing. And it was decided based on the inquiries that Mr. DeLaura had received, who also, by the way, if you review the minutes, noted that the neighbor thought their property to the east had wetlands. So at that time, Mr. DeLaura and Mr. Anderson had inquiries about the project, and the hearing was scheduled because there was public interest. I've said this before, but the distinction is very critical, and I know we had this discussion last meeting, because the case that was cited, Starble versus Inland Wetlands, is a very different case than ours. That case was a wetlands case that the applicant wanted to install a driveway directly across a wetland. So we have a direct impact wetland case, not here where we have minor activity in the exterior portions of the upland review area. That's the first difference. Second difference, more importantly, is the agency in that case made a finding that the activity may have a significant impact on the wetlands that were on that site. And because they made that finding and based their public hearing upon it, that is what triggered the obligation of the applicant to show the absence of a feasible and prudent alternative. So this is not our case. Our case is not having a public hearing because of such a finding. And it's very important because although Mr. Ainsworth pointed out to you that 22A41A2 indicates that the applicant has to show his purpose and any feasible, prudent alternatives to the proposed regulated activity, which alternatives would cause less or no environmental impact. He neglected to cite to you section 22A-41B1, which basically says, in the case of an application which received a public hearing, either because, and I'm paraphrasing, a petition with enough people was signed, which is one of the ways you can get a public hearing, or because of a specific finding of potential significant impact. Neither of those occurred here. It is then and only then that you have to make a finding of the absence of reasonable and prudent alternative. Regardless of the distinction in the law, we've presented to you an application that has no impact on wetlands, none. David Lord has said it, Rick Hosley has said it, Mike Ott has said it. The impacts are positive. The water that's going to that wetland area will be infiltrated. It will travel a further distance. The septic system, which is located closest to the wetland that's there now, will be removed. So the only impact is that it's a positive impact. So any discussion of a feasible and reasonable alternative is moot when you don't have any impact. It has to be an alternative that would result in less effect on the wetlands. We don't have any effect. We spent much time to develop the infrastructure to make sure. So getting to our mission, which is what ultimately we've got to focus on. And in light of the way this has panned out and the way it's occurred over the multiple hearings, I am requesting from the agency your focus on what we actually need to find. And specifically, we need to look at the proposed activities that we've demonstrated present no impact, no direct impact to wetlands on our site, because there are no wetlands on the site. As to the upland review area, our professionals have carefully and scientifically designed a plan to avoid impact of any sort, never mind an adverse sort, of any sort. The proposed activities have a positive effect on the off-site wetlands compared to what exists today. The intervener has, throughout their presentation, thrown up speculation. At the last hearing, we heard the magic words of vernal pool and the hue and cry of a potential adverse impact from pollutants that need to be looked at in light of what's actually occurring at the site today. The situation will not be appreciably different. And the effect on the wetlands is non-existent, de minimis at best, which is why we didn't have a public hearing, because of potential for significant impact. So what we've presented in front of you is an application supporting materials, testimony from very well-respected professionals, reports upon reports of very well-respected professionals. And we've presented more than substantial evidence that there will not be an adverse impact on the wetlands, either off-site wetland. We've demonstrated that we've met the requirements for the permit and that we're eligible for the relief we seek. And we would urge you to grant the permit to allow this process to proceed. As I said earlier, to the extent you have concerns, I am certain that they can be addressed with an appropriate condition to your permit and/or permits to a special exception permit, which we hope will be issued in the near future. With that, I don't know whether any of my experts have anything to add or want to address based on what Mr. Trinkus and Mr. Logan have said in their response.
You're on mute.
John Cunningham, once again, I'll just make a quick comment on one of Mr. Logan's comments. I apologize, I should have put in my letter. Any type of fertilization on any of my projects is done by a licensed professional, okay? Not the homeowners association by themselves. Any permeable application, whether it be wash stone, permeable stone, needs at least a 12-inch base minimum of some form of bank gravel, pea stone or something like that. So that would have to be below the garden area. Okay.
I think I have just a couple of really quick things if you're all set, John.
Yep.
So Mr. Phillips, I think it was, asked a question about stormwater management report and trees. You know, the removal of trees is typically not a subject covered in a stormwater management report for a land development application or any other kind of engineering proposal. Mr. Cunningham can talk about what trees will be removed, but I just wanted to point out it's typically not included in the stormwater management report. Another neighbor, and I think last time mentioned, if I understand it right, seems to be saying that we are filling or raising the ground surface elevation to construct the carriage house #1, I believe it is, which would be units 4 and 5, I think, along parallel to the easterly property boundary. Between the back of that structure and the easterly property boundary, if you study the plans, I just want to make sure this gets on the record and the agency should look at this. We are not raising the ground surface elevation. The building will be raised, of course, and the first floor of the building will be elevated, but the ground surface between that building and the property boundary is not being raised. Just really quickly, and maybe most importantly, two things. I neglected to say earlier that if the wetland agency thinks about this development proposal, we are removing a building and removing pavement such that we will not have an impervious surface lane cover within 110 feet of our property boundary closest to the offsite wetland. The two buildings that are being constructed each have a footprint of approximately 2,850 square feet. I think everyone familiar with Madison anyway would agree that that's a pretty average size single family home. These are not large structures. This is not a multi-family development. I think it's important to point out that in addition to the removal of those impervious surfaces in a key location closest to the offsite wetland, those two buildings that are being constructed have a footprint of 2,850 square feet apiece, the size of a typical, I think you'd all agree, the typical single-family residential home. Mr. McCann, Attorney McCann, mentioned something that I completely forgot to mention. We are actually removing a leaching field that serves the estate residents that is located approximately in the footprint of carriage house number 1. So that there will be no more leaching fields in this southern catchment area where groundwater may drain toward the offsite wetland. There will be no more subsurface sewage disposal system leaching fields. In addition, the existing septic tank and wastewater effluent pump station for the carriage house will be removed. I keep forgetting to mention both of those things, so those should get on. And lastly, I think Dave's gonna mute Dave. Okay. Lastly, and probably most importantly, I looked through the last revision of my stormwater management report, and I kept listening to the testimony about stormwater is going to move very quickly through the natural soils on the site because of the sands and gravels. Well, I know the applicant wasn't present during the test pits, and not the applicant, the intervener was not present during the test pits, but and the test pit descriptions were not done by a soil scientist, but they were done by myself and the local health department. These, although the soil textures classifications were sands and gravels, this isn't the soils in the rear are not the same very sands and gravels in the front in the northern catchment area. I don't think, having witnessed the test pits and observed them myself, that the movement of water through these soils will be highly rapid. And I understand why the applicant, the intervener, may have looked at the test pit logs and made that assumption, but it's just not the case if you were out in the field and observed the test pits. And lastly, most importantly, maybe I keep saying lastly, but this is last, we neglected in our stormwater management report to talk about the type of fill that's going to be replaced. We gave Mr. Schumacher an explanation, an estimate of the quantity, but we typically, when we place fill material beneath a subsurface stormwater infiltration system, it has to be carefully chosen. Its texture has to be carefully chosen. It cannot be granular fill. It is typically a mixture of topsoil, leaf compost, and sand, a specified mixture. And I want to get in the record. I apologize. We actually neglected to put that in our stormwater management report. We should have. and on our drawings. I don't believe it's on our drawings. But I want to get on the record that the fill material placed beneath and surrounding the subsurface stormwater infiltration system will be carefully chosen to provide the biological activity that is needed to treat stormwater as it makes its way through that fill material and then through the natural soils. And it will be a mixture of topsoil, leaf compost, and sand. We do this frequently. There are a lot of publications, including some from the University of Connecticut, about the mixture and about the depth. Typically, studies have shown that the depth needs to be a minimum of 2.5 feet. You'll see publications where the depth needs to be 5 feet. We will have adequate depth because of the fill depth that we have to place. So I just want to make sure that that gets into the record. And that concludes the additional comments that I have.
Great. All right. Undoubtedly, Mr. Hosley.
Thank you for the opportunity. I wanted to state for the record that in my lifetime, I have never performed any wetlands probes. I did very early on walk the property without direction or guidance, not realizing that the tennis court and stone posts and fencing, stone walls, were not part of the ledges, for the record. I heard the word assumption used by two of the experts in opposition of this project. And I'd like to think that we didn't assume anything when we were investigating the blasting aspect of this. Specifically, I'd like to talk about the topography. I have found variations in the flown topographic map that George Logan referred to out in the field. Some are significant, some are not. I think that has to do with the existence of trees and that sort of thing. Mr. Logan talked about the assumption that the refusal of the test pits were on ledge or rock. I think we could assume without further investigation that that could be a boulder or glacial till, which is found on the site. And then lastly, I questioned the topographic map that showed topography in the center of the tennis court. I just assumed the tennis court was flat, but didn't review that. So without further ado, those are the only things that stood out in my mind.
Great. Okay, so Mr. Ainsworth, do you have comments?
Are you going to answer?
As briefly as I can, I will.
Okay, so that's great, but I'm just going to say that at this point, there's been some insinuations from both sides about trespassing or not trespassing. Our board doesn't deal with that. So if you guys have issues with that, I think we should move that on to someone else, like the police or whatever. I would like to really stick to just kind of the facts and everything else. So I both of you have been going back and forth about that. And I really would like to just stick to the wetlands issues. The trespassing issue is not something that we can deal with. But now you get to go, Mr. Ainsworth.
Thank you. Some of the comments we just heard from Mr. Ott, we're hearing new information for the first time in final rebuttal, where he's talking about, well, we neglected to talk about the type of fill. We neglected to talk about if the agency, thinks about this development proposal. If you neglect to talk about things, the intervener can only respond to what it sees. And so what essentially Mr. Ott was telling is well, we described soil characteristics, but don't really believe that because we weren't accurate, or it meant something other than what it says. If the observations in the field are something other than what they're described as, then that should be documented. I can't, nobody can respond to that kind of data. When someone says, oh no, what you saw in that report that I submitted as material for this commission to consider wasn't really that, it was something else. I really don't know what to do with that. That's unusual, frankly. Did they do a sieve test? I mean, if they're saying, well, I think it will, I mean, Mr. Ott saying, I believe that, the water will transmit through the soil in some fashion. Did you do a sieve test? Did you do a test by which you put the soils into a tube, dropped water through it, and actually calculated? There are tests to determine these things. And so, I don't know how to respond to evidence that I've never seen before. And then finally, I mean, he actually said, this is not a multifamily development. It absolutely is a multifamily development. You have two families, units attached to one another in multiple locations. That's multifamily development. That there's absolutely no other way to say that. It is in fact a multifamily development. So there are things being said here that are just not credible. But getting back to the things that matter, which is ultimately this issue of the alternatives is very real and very meaningful. The Starbull case does control, and yes, the facts of that case were different, but the holding that the appellate court ruled on in 2018 is binding, and it does say that the presentation of feasible and prudent alternatives is mandatory under the regulations. And in that case, New Hartford's regulations were almost word for word identical, and the differences are immaterial in terms of the diction and phraseology. They were identical to the regulations before this commission. It has to be mandatory that some feasible and prudent alternative has to be presented before this commission in order for this commission to carry out its own stated standards that require you to consider feasible and prudent alternatives. Now, the applicant asserts, well, there's no impact. That's an assumption on their part. They have some testimony to that effect, but we have, as if there were no other testimony that matters. Their experts are people who have experience in the field, so are ours. My experts and myself have all practiced before agencies for at least this similar period of time to these folks. And so we have placed into the record substantial evidence of the kinds of impacts that will occur to the downstream wetlands. And so to simply say, ignore all that, therefore you don't have to look at feasible and prudent alternatives, is not how wetlands law works. Not at least in 2018, 2019, 2021. Maybe in 2012, it did. Maybe in 2015, it did. But as of the Starbull case, it doesn't. And that's why it sometimes confuses wetlands professionals and other professionals why the feasible and prudent alternatives are necessary, because it didn't used to be, but it is now. However, I leave the applicant to its presentation. They chose not to present those. We have outlined that issue. So ultimately, we have presented to this commission that there's multiple reasons why this application will have negative impacts to the wetlands. We do believe that the application could be improved in a number of different ways that have not been presented, and that frankly, the application should be denied so that this can either be done right or be downscaled so that it can be done in a way that does not pose the impacts that you've heard testimony on this evening. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess, so Dave Anderson, while we are in the public hearing, is this the point when, if any of the agency members have any more questions that they should ask?
Yeah, if you have any more questions of the applicant, I'd ask those now. And then if there's no further questions and the applicant doesn't have anything else to add, then we could close the public hearing.
Okay, so inland wetland agency members, do you have any lingering last questions for anybody on this call? Oh, yeah, Tom Paul.
Yeah, I'm a little disappointed dealing with the garden situation. The town of Madison's Park and Rec has community gardens, the Bauer Farm. which I've had a plot over there for a long time, they allow organic fertilizers, no chemical pesticides or herbicides, and it's very simple. Why we haven't had that discussion with the town permits, I'm not sure. But it just isn't a little thing. It's a big thing right next to the wetlands. And I walked there, and I know Dave Newton was with me too, looking at that wetland. And that's one of the major effects on the wetland. And it just seems like no one wants to address it.
Okay. Okay, so I guess to summarize your comments, you're just concerned that the fact of this nutrient input in the garden area is an issue.
Yeah, directly, it can directly have an adverse effect on the wetland.
Okay.
Even though it's not on that property.
Okay. Any other questions from anybody? No? No? Okay, I can't see Dave Newton, but he's not saying anything, or John. So I'm going to assume that our questions have all been answered. All right, so do we need to make a motion? Does someone need to make a motion to close this hearing?
I'll make a motion that we close the hearing on, I've lost the application.
21-03.
21-03, 856 Boston Post Road.
I'll second the motion.
Okay. Any other discussion, comments, any last words? All right, all in favor of closing this public hearing?
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right, public hearing is closed. So our job now is to take all this information and make a decision on this. And I know we've heard lots, and we've had multiple experts with decades worth of experience on both sides. But ultimately, really, we need to just figure out where we're at on the impacts to the wetland. So does anybody I have comments, but I would love to hear from you all and get a sense of what you're thinking. Joe?
I'll
I
start
gave
here.
mine.
Oh. Go ahead, Tom.
No, I said I gave mine. I just gave it.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay, so first, are we voting tonight, Kia?
Yes, we would. It would be great to get.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I guess first and foremost, I think, if one side has excellent professionals and someone who's against the proposal, they're going to come up with excellent professionals, and they're all going to have one task to support their side. So in the end, I think I understand the side of the neighbors, but I think in a common sense way, with regards to our charge, which is to limit the impact on 2 wetlands, I think there will not be an adverse impact on either one if this proposal goes forward. And I'm going to add to that. I think I haven't seen a site plan in a while, but I know I've seen it. And I do want to support that curbing somewhere gets installed to help direct water from leaving a paved surface. So I'm going to be pro curbing where it can be applied. I do want the neighbors to know that the Wetlands Commission, we're looking at the wetlands. After this, there's going to be many people looking at this proposal and making comments such as, let's keep the water from running off the side of the property, although not going toward a wetland, it's going to maybe affect the neighbor. The town engineer can stop that from happening. So there's going to be plenty of opportunities for a town engineer to limit any water leaving the premises. The fire marshal, he's going to be totally in charge of blasting plans and making sure that the company who's hired does this in the best manner going forward. And he will oversee the whole process of notifying neighbors. So I guess deep down, the special exception process that's going to follow will tighten the ship on what is built there. On our side, I think I just want to say thanks to both sides for coming forward with eye-opening testimony. And I know I'm forgetting one thing, but deep down on our end, I think there's going to be no adverse impact. Finally, the garden, I know I would also support a condition on our permit saying at the special exception process, hit it hard with low impact development standards to make everyone happy with regards to water getting through the garden. Okay, that's it. I'm going to support the application.
Okay.
Can you hear me now or not?
Yes.
You can. Oh,
Yes.
I don't know why you couldn't hear me before.
Oh, we could hear you. I just can't see you, unfortunately. But that's okay.
That's okay. You can't. It's not important. I think Joe summarized what I was going to say. I think both sides gave great presentations. I think Attorney McEwen gave a pretty good summary at the end of what his thoughts are, what my thoughts are also. I listened very closely to the explosives expert, Mr. Husley. I was very impressed with some of his presentation material, not so much his ability to get a picture on a screen, but I think he knows his blasting. And as far as the septic systems and their impact on the wetlands, they're over 400, almost 500 feet away from the wetlands. If you look at it, if you scale it out on a drawing, I listened to both the engineers, and I think that the wetlands are going to be fine with this project going on.
Right. Any other comments from any of the members?
Well,
Tom, yes.
I'd support this with point that only, this is with the garden, which I just showed my concerns, that we only use organic fertilizers and no chemical pesticides or herbicides. If that's part of the conditions, then I can support this.
Yeah. One of the problems with that, though, there's no way to enforce it. I mean, if the project gets completed and the apartments get sold, there's no way that that can get enforced. That's one of the problems.
Well, I know, but that's the people who run, if it's a homeowners association, they're responsible.
Well, no one talked about a homeowners association.
Well, I thought we did.
It's unclear if there will be a homeowners association. There could be, there may not be. That is not yet determined, as far as I can tell from the comments from Mr. McKeon. Any other comments?
Yep.
Yes,
one
Joe.
more key. I forgot and just remembered. Just wanted to comment on the feasible alternatives. So obviously, zoning allows, I guess, 6 or 7 or 5 or 6 units on the property. So the applicant has that in going for them. So obviously, we're just focused on what they're proposing with the wetlands nearby. They're pulling away a building from the wetlands to the southeast. That's a positive. I'm not a fan of the blasting, but I also wish that the neighbors put the wetlands on a map that they had delineated. I still don't think it makes sense to delineate it and that show us what's there, but still hearsay. I think that wetlands is protected. Okay, I'm done.
Okay. I will make a few comments. Yes, I think we all learned quite a lot about blasting and the geology of the area, which is great. I think a good point was made, organic versus synthetic fertilizers. They're all fertilizers. It's just the process by which they go through. So I agree with John that it is hard to enforce that. I do think that all of that area, and I think some people have brought this up, I mean, minimizing nutrients into those wetlands would be ideal. It's hard to enforce. So whether we put a condition about the garden, I don't know. You guys can think about it for a couple seconds. I also think there should be, I know in the stormwater management plan, they have the detailed maintenance for the underground galleries and infiltration system. I think, you know, for all these types of systems, there should be something called out that is maintained, because otherwise they get put in. And I think we've seen this in other instances, unless it's town owned, and even if it is town owned, they're not necessarily well maintained. And that seems to be a critical feature of managing stormwater on this property. Those are, I think, my wetland. I think this is a lot of building on a space, but as Joe very nicely pointed out, this goes on to presumably another commission that can deal with other aspects of this that do not come under our jurisdiction. All right, any other comments? Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion. Someone's got to do it because we need to get this done.
I'll make a motion,
Off.
Kia. I will do you a solid.
Thank you.
I'm going to move or make a motion that the commission approves application 21-03 at such address. I don't have the agenda in front of me for the 2 new buildings and property development. I was just gonna put 2 potential conditions, one being that regular maintenance of the infiltrators take place on maybe a twice a year calendar, and that lid practices be installed at the special exception process as much as possible.
I will second that, but I will also add.
Can I stop you? Sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
Joe, I don't really understand the second condition and how.
Oh.
Because you're saying a condition to modify the plan in some way, but that requires approval from the Planning and Zoning Commission. I'm not sure that you can actually.
Well, I'll just say the commission strongly requests that lid practices be a part of a final approval from the P&Z.
Joe, we can't have anything on there about the chemicals used, the fertilizer and chemicals?
I think, well, Joe can clarify. Are your lid measures that you're thinking of, is it just the curbing, or are you thinking of the chemicals as well?
Well, say for example, the curbing keeps water from running off, and maybe a rain garden somewhere, that a depressed area near the garden area that could help catch water.
So maybe
Simple
we
stuff.
just, well, is there any reason, and Dave Anderson, you can jump in, is there any reason not for us to put that in as a condition? The rain garden in the garden?
Plus we had a neighbor who was concerned about runoff, and I don't even think he was near wetlands.
I think
can't
that's
remember.
separate. That wasn't near us.
True,
That is
but
the
that's
other
where
side.
the P&Z can help him.
Right,
That's
but
all.
okay. But if you want.
I guess if you have, I guess and then John Delora, feel free to jump in as well. But I guess what I would encourage you to do is be specific, because otherwise I think it's going to be hard for either the Planning and Zoning Commission to understand whether or not they're implementing measures that addresses your condition. It's also going to be hard for us to enforce whether or not that
Right.
condition. is
Okay,
met. So
but
think it
then
needs
I
to be
would
specific.
say if the proposed garden area can be depressed in some way that it becomes kind of a rain garden. I'll just stick to that corner of the property.
Okay. So Joe's motion
And-
is to
and
approve.
curbing.
And curbing is to
Yeah.
approve with the conditions of a rain garden or otherwise some depression to keep water in the garden area, and curbing to more direct flow towards the infiltration system.
Correct.
Okay, so that is the motion. Is that clear enough, Dave Anderson, John
Yes.
Delora? Okay. Okay, so we have a motion.
I'll second it. I don't necessarily agree with the conditions, but I have no problem. But I think the project does enough to protect the wetlands that it should be approved.
Okay, so we have a second from Dave Newton. So Dave, we now have an opportunity if you want to discuss. We can, that is part of this process. If you want to discuss, modify, add your own, anything else.
No, I'll leave it the way that Joe said.
Okay. Would anybody else on the
Well,
agency?
I just don't understand why you don't want to, the garden area is so close to the wetlands, why we don't want to stipulate something like that.
Because you
But,
can't
so I think-
enforce it.
Yes, we can't. It's hard to enforce. I think what Joe has proposed is a way to keep what happens there on that space so that it infiltrates and doesn't do surface runoff. And if there's a depression or a rain garden or something that can keep the water more on that space, then
We have no idea what the engineering part's going to look like. We don't know anything.
no, but it's a condition. So John Delora will be hopefully helping. So I guess, Tom, I understand your concern, but outside of banning pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers, there's no way to keep chemicals off of someone's property. It doesn't matter if it's organic or not. It's just, you would have to just say, you can't have that. And I suppose we could say that, but the reality, I think, is that that's not going to happen. I mean, it'd be great. I don't put anything on my lawn, but I'm not going to inflict that on everyone else. So I think that's kind of where we're at. But I'm happy to hear from others if you have other comments about that, if I'm mistaking that. No. But Tom, to your point, you're right. There isn't an engineering plan for a rain garden or depression, but they're going to have to come back with that, presumably. I mean, that's why we have conditions. And the same with the maintenance plan. They'll have to, be specific about that.
Oh, okay. So you're saying they're going to have to, if we approve this, they're going to have to come back and we're going to have to approve their design.
No. That it stays with town staff at that point.
Well,
John
Delora's he's got to approve it.
He's going to be, yes, advising, watching over. I know he's very excited about that.
Yeah.
All right, this is so fun, but does anybody have any other questions before we can vote and move on to, we have one other agenda item.
What?
What? You guys
What?
don't read the agenda? All right, so
How-
let's
how
vote
did-
on this
how-
first.
How did that get on the agenda to begin with?
We can talk about that in a minute. So we're going to put everybody out of their agony and we are going to vote. So we have a motion, we have a second, we've had our discussion. Is there any other discussion? Okay, all in favor of this application with the conditions as we have discussed, say aye or raise your hand
Aye.
and raise your hand. Okay, any opposed?
I
Abstaining?
abstain.
Okay, Tom Paul's abstaining. All right. So this application is moving on to another commission, which is great for us. And we are going to move on to our other agenda item, which is because Mike Ott left us at the last meeting. And it's a subdivision. And so it got stuck on here because we knew he would be here.
Oh,
I
but it,
apologize. I forgot last time, so I just clicked off. Sorry about that.
Well, and here we are.
That's why you're here.
but it's a subdivision referral, right?
It's a subdivision referral,
Yeah,
42
okay.
Pleasant View.
Yeah, right.
I have a written presentation I'd like to make. About 45
Please
minutes
don't.
to an hour. No.
Please don't.
Have
I'm
any
sorry.
extras?
So
We heard enough from you.
okay, I know you did. I know. I'm tired of listening to myself.
No, I'm kidding.
All right, so just for the record, Mike Ott, licensed professional engineer and land surveyor. I'm here representing John and Laura Hardy. This subdivision was approved to create an additional lot at 42 Pleasant View. The owners have decided to sell the new lot that was created, and they negotiated with the buyers and wanted to shift the lot line a little bit. And that's what this is. So this is a lot line revision application that was made to the Planning and Zoning Commission. And because there's wetlands on the lot, I think Dave and John thought it should be referred to you all. I can show you the plan on the revised subdivision plan on my screen if you'd like, but it simply shifts the lot line some 12 feet or so, I think, toward the wetland, I would think.
12 feet.
Yeah, something like that. Would you like me to show my screen or?
Yes.
Do you have any idea where they're going to build?
I do. I can.
Are they going to build in the front or the back?
In the back, they actually met out there. Bear with me 1 second. They met out there last Friday. The current owners and the new owners and their builder had a meeting, and they talked about where they would like to build. And if I could share my screen, which I'm doing right now, hopefully you can see that. That was a lot quicker than Rick Hosley, I think. So the new lot, the new division line I'm tracing with my cursor, and then it goes down on an angle here and out to Pleasant View. Here's the wetland. It's a depression.
Yeah, right.
It's a depression in the corner. Rich Snarsky delineated it. My understanding is they want to put their house up here on the high ground.
Uh-huh. Okay.
These are 2-foot contours, I think. So this is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10-ish feet higher than the wetland boundary, something like that.
So how far away is it? I didn't measure it. It doesn't make it nervous.
Boy, I don't know, Dave. It might be.
Yeah.
I'm trying to look at something to judge it by. This is 70 feet. This has got to be it. I suspect that we're going to come to you with an application. I would guess there's going to be grading within 100 feet of this, and unless John can approve it administratively, we'll be coming to an application. Not the house and not the septic system, but I suspect there'll be some grading within 100 feet, and that's irrespective of where this lot line is. Doesn't matter.
Okay, so it's basically, it's just this lot line.
This line right here, and then this angled line that
Right.
goes out to Pleasant View. Yep,
Right,
that's the line that changed, the one I'm tracing,
right.
the division line that changed.
I think the referral should be that we have no objections with, while recognizing that wetlands application would be required if they're within the 100-foot review area, something to that effect.
Right, and I think this is referral, so I think, we have different options, as we learned with our Longshore Lane application. In the past, for many of these subdivision referrals, I think our discussion and our minutes has sufficed, but Dave Anderson and John Flora can correct me if I'm wrong. I think sometimes those have sufficed as, yes, we don't see any significant issues. There have been past issues with subdivision referrals. If we do see issues, potential issues with wetlands, then we, as we did with Longshore, we delineate those.
So Dave, was that a motion you made, Dave?
I believe so.
Yes, but I guess what I'm saying is, I don't know if we need to vote on this. And
No.
that's why, right, I don't think we need to vote. This is just a discussion.
That was a recommendation, Lee.
Yes.
Whoever writes the letter.
We can utilize the minutes of the meeting if they're available. If not, we can communicate it verbally to the commission. So
Okay.
Right. That was my recollection. And I think,
Okay, all right, yeah.
we can, so it sounds like everyone is okay with these revisions, recognizing, as Dave pointed out, that it's likely that we may see this again once building plans are set.
I agree with that.
Okay. So Mike, could you stop sharing your screen since thank you. That was very fast. All right, great. I didn't see anything else on the agenda. We pretty much filled up our time. Anybody want to talk some more?
No.
Thank you, Kia, for guiding us through this.
Oh,
Yeah, thank
no, you
you.
guys are the best.
Thank you guys for this one and for the last one also. Thank you for your patience.
All right.
And with that, I will click off.
Okay.
Have a good night.
And yes, and I guess we will see each other again the first Monday in June. Are we ever going to be in person again, or no, never?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Eventually.
Okay. All right, but not in June.
No.
Okay. Okay. Well, then I will see you all like this in a couple
Okay.
of weeks. Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thanks,
Good night.
everybody.